Earlier this year, it was reported that Jeff Bezos was the first person in history to be worth more than $200 billion and is currently the richest person on Earth. He makes an unbelievable $13 million per hour. But what if I told you someone in history was worth much, much, much more than Jeff Bezos? So much more, in fact, that their wealth is considered by many professionals to be inconceivable, incalculable, and so vast that nobody will ever reach it again. Today, we're going to discuss the wealth of Mansa Musa, king of Mali, the wealthiest man in history. We'll take a look at how he acquired his fortune and what exactly he spent all that money on. Let your mind drift back to 14th century Europe. The bubonic plague is sweeping across the land, decimating cities and killing 1/3 of the continent's population. War is rampant, leaving many dead. The streets are full of garbage and, well, actual feces. Frankly, it's a miserable time to be alive. But if you look a bit south to Africa, it's the exact opposite. The economy is booming. There are mosques being built, universities being constructed, art being made, and spread all across the continent. And at the helm of it all is Musa Keita I, who was known as Mansa Musa after he took charge of the Kingdom of Mali in 1312 BCE. Under Mansa Musa's rule, the Kingdom of Mali was massive, stretching across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Niger, Gambia, Nigeria, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, stretching nearly 2,000 miles from one end to the other. And within that territory, there were resources that made Mali and Mansa Musa unbelievably wealthy. It's believed that during his reign, the Empire of Mali was in control of half of the world's gold. If there was an empire that had control of half of the world's gold today, well, from the gold alone, they would be worth more than $5 trillion. That's twice the GDP of the United Kingdom. But it wasn't just gold that Mansa Musa's empire was in control of. The Empire of Mali stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Sahara Desert, covering rainforests, plains, and all the resources that could be found within them. Much of the fortune of Mali came from salt deposits and elephant ivory, which were big sources of profit at the time. When Mansa Musa took the throne, the kingdom was already wealthy, but he took things a step further, expanding the territory to include 24 cities, taking control of towns like Timbuktu, which allowed the kingdom to trade more freely. So, Mansa Musa was a fan of conquering, of earning more resources for himself and his country. But what exactly did he do with those resources? Frankly, he liked to spend them in ways that would put Marie Antoinette and Jeff Bezos to shame. To get a real understanding of how absurdly wealthy Mansa Musa really was, it's important to look at the most ostentatious display of his fortune during his reign, his pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa, like most of the people in Mali, was Muslim, and while many Muslims completed their pilgrimage to Mecca, no one in history has done it quite as luxuriously as Mansa Musa did. For starters, it wasn't just all Mansa Musa traveling through the desert on a camel, sweating in the sun. He traveled in comfort, with plush accommodations that he didn't even have to set up himself, because he had an entourage the size of a city. It's estimated that there were 60,000 people in his caravan, traveling with him at all times. This caravan included 1,000 attendants, including 500 attendants that solely served his head wife. There were 500 slaves who carried something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in the hands of slaves: golden staffs that weighed 6 pounds each. For reference, that's 3,000 pounds of gold total. But that wasn't the only gold on the journey. There were 100 camels carrying 300 pounds of gold each. That's around 30,000 pounds worth of gold total. Today, 30,000 pounds of gold would be worth around $888 million. With the additional cost of the golden staffs, that'd be equal to around $970 million. just short of $1 billion, and all owned exclusively by Mansa Musa. When you add in the fact that he also owned many of the people in his caravan, including thousands of slaves and attendants, well, that just adds to his worth and the extravagant display of wealth that this journey really was. The female slaves wore brocade and Yemeni silk gowns, something very few people could afford, and far from the typical clothes you'd imagine slaves to be wearing. There were also hundreds more camels who carried silk, other textiles, and supplies for the group. Along the way to Mecca, the group stopped in foreign cities and went on shopping sprees, where they'd buy pounds of specialty foods, luxury clothing, and confectionery treats. When the majority of Europe was starving, Mansa Musa was blowing money like there was no tomorrow. And buying things wasn't the only way he blew money. He was known for giving money to the poor as he passed through towns, and often gave money to different organizations. And though, at first glance, it doesn't seem like spending your fortune in towns and giving away to the poor could cause any issues, but that wasn't exactly the case here. Mansa Musa left a trail of gold behind him everywhere he went, and when he arrived in Cairo, that gold had quite an impact. Mansa Musa intended to push through Cairo on his way to Mecca, but the Sultan, Al-Nasir, insisted that he stay and meet him. So, instead, Mansa Musa stayed in a palace in Cairo for 3 months, spending his fortune and lounging around, enjoying the spoils that come with being a king. But upon finally leaving Cairo, the economy took a huge hit due to his generosity and extreme wealth. The incomprehensible amount of gold he left behind actually depreciated the value of gold, which took Egypt 12 years to recover from. Can you imagine being so wealthy that simply spending your money as you please could cripple the economy of a mighty empire? I mean, there's rich, and then there's Mansa Musa rich. During that trip, it wasn't just his wealth that was spread, it was word of his wealth. The empire of Mali was widely unknown at the time, but became something of intrigue after the rest of the world saw the amount of money the kingdom had to burn. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali, he wasn't done spending just quite yet. During his travels, he collected artists, poets, scholars, and architects, and brought them back with him, intending to grow his cities even more. He got to work building dozens of mosques, universities, and palaces. One particular mosque, the Jingarabir Mosque, was commissioned by Mansa Musa. The mosque was one of the largest and most impressive in all of Africa, and has withstood the test of time, as it is still standing today, 700 years later. The mosque was designed by a famous architect who was paid in 440 pounds of gold, equal to about $8.2 million in today's money. The mosque has 3 inner courts, 2 minarets, and 25 rows of pillars that had enough prayer space for 2,000 people at a time. Then there were the universities, specifically Sankore University. Mansa Musa strongly believed in educating and advancing the citizens of his empire, so he commissioned Sankore University to facilitate just that. The university could house 25,000 people, which is more than Harvard University can house today. It contained one of the largest libraries in the world, rivaling the Library of Alexandria. It's believed to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts, though many scholars suggest there may have been up to 1 million. The scholars, artists, and scientists that Mansa Musa brought back from his trips worked with the university, creating a fairly modern schedule and structure. There were 4 levels of schooling, which were the equivalent of degrees today. Students would receive special turbans upon graduating from each level, and classes involved both secular and non-secular teachings. And though Mansa Musa spent a lot of his fortune on his community, he wasn't shy about spending a little bit on himself. Though his palace no longer stands, and there are no records detailing what exactly it looked like, we can take a look at palaces of nearby kingdoms to get an idea of what kind of extravagance his palace must have held. Most palaces weren't just one building. They could be the size of an entire city, with audience halls, courtyards, villas, secondary palace buildings for extended royal family members, apartments for officials, and the specific royal apartment. The area for the king and his wife often included bedrooms, dressing rooms, private audience chambers, a courtyard with gardens, and a harem, because that's how they did things back in the day. The palace ground also included dozens of courtyards, worship temples, and in some cases, even ceremonial lakes. And judging by how much Mansa Musa loved gold and silk, I think it's safe to say his palace was probably decorated wall to wall with the most luxurious materials and surely things that he brought back from his lengthy travels. And though we don't know exactly how much Mansa Musa earned, we know one thing: his wealth was so vast that he was able to propel his kingdom far into the future. Unfortunately, that vast wealth came with a downside. Word of his fortune spread into Europe, which ended up contributing to the kingdom's downfall. By the 15th century, Portugal was conducting naval raids against the kingdom, and shortly after, the colonization of the kingdom and continent contributed to the inevitable demise of the Mali Empire. So, there you have it, how the richest man in history spent his fortune. I wonder why Jeff Bezos isn't out building palaces all over the place. What about you guys? What would you do if you were worth hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And maybe turn on post notifications for the one time.